Thank you, all of our retreatants, for joining us again for this, our last dialogue between a Plum Village brother and a visiting neuroscientist, in this case, and a psychiatrist, Dr. Iain Mcgilchrist, who started out his scholarly career as a fellow of All Souls College, which is a famous institution. The university is sort of an elite institution. Oxford is a rather elite university, and within Oxford, All Souls is quite a special place. Iain was a fellow there, I think twice, was it? And wrote a book 3 times. I wrote a book against criticism. What's that?
It doesn't make it any better.
Oh, that's all right. I wrote a book against criticism, which essentially said that we lost genius by dividing it into parts, presaging his most famous work, which is what drew our interest to him, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, which essentially does a very good job of laying out what the right and the left hemispheres sort of, how they approach the world, we can say, more so than what they can do. A subtle topic, which is often misunderstood, avoiding the normal dichotomies that a lot of our retreatants might have heard about. For example, that one is artistic and one is logical. Those kinds of things. I think Iain will probably get a chance to explain that to you himself more, but also echoing what our teacher Thich Nhat Hanh has said a number of times, that the Western world is descending into an analytical state of mind, much to its detriment, and in the process losing presence, and supporting that hypothesis with records from art, from literature, and all sorts of circumstantial evidence, which draws connections to the neurological literature. And we, of course, became very interested in him as well, because our teacher Thich Nhat Hanh had a massive left hemispheric stroke, lost all function of that hemisphere for some time, and so the monks became very interested in Iain's work, especially Brother Phap Linh, who's joining us today as a senior Dhamma teacher at Plum Village.
Thank you, Liam, and thank you so much, Iain, for joining us for this conversation or dialogue today. It's a great honor for us to have you with us. And perhaps we can start, I think, by, I'd like to, for those of us in the audience who maybe haven't read your book, they may have heard of it, but maybe haven't had a chance to read it yet. Maybe it's a vast undertaking, but maybe you could give a sort of a sketch, a little of how the differences in the qualities of the left and right hemispheres in their approach to the world show up for us as human beings. And I wonder particularly how it might feel, as it were, from the inside, to be more in the world of the left hemisphere, or more in the world of the right hemisphere. Because I think, as my feeling as a meditator in this tradition is that, well, when I read your description of those two worlds, I feel like I recognize one. Well, I recognize both, but I recognize the one that we're trying to cultivate in this practice. But I advance that, only as a hypothesis, and that's what I think is interesting about this discussion, that we can explore whether there is a real correspondence or not. So maybe I hand it over to you and just invite you, to tell us how, for you, these worlds might feel from the inside, but also then, if you don't mind, to give us a sense of where the scientific community is at relative to your thesis that you advanced, and how it's been received a little bit, or perhaps what the evidence is now. The publication of that book was, I think, 2009, so there's obviously been a lot of studies following on. Okay, so I think that's probably enough to be getting on with.
It certainly is, and it's a task you've set me, and a very reasonable one. It's a 600-page book and took me 20 years to write, so I'll do my best. It might be best to take your second point first, how it's been received, because that sets the scene really for what I'm going to say. Because a lot of people will have heard that it's all pop psychology and that there's nothing in it and all the rest of it. And to cut a very long story short, there's some truth in that, in the things that we used to say about it and the things that are bandied around in management seminars and sometimes in psychology lectures are usually wrong. So I'd say to people, put out of your mind most of the things you think you know, because they're virtually none of them right. But there is the fact that the brain is divided, which is an extraordinary fact. I mean, over evolution, it didn't have to be divided. It could be one mass, and it exists to make connections. So on the face of it, there's a puzzle there. There's another puzzle, which is that the brain is asymmetrical. And not just the brain, but every neural network in every living creature is asymmetrical. And this goes right back to the most ancient neural net that we know in a sea creature, Nematocella vectensis, the first neural network that evolved that we're aware of 700 million years ago. It's asymmetrical. And the third thing I suppose to say is that the connection between the two parts of the brain only begins with mammals. So there is a band of fibers called the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres. It only starts with mammals, and it started as largely facilitatory, and it's ended up, putting it very crudely and simply, as largely inhibitory. I mean, I'd need to qualify that a bit. But effectively, you wouldn't be wrong if you thought of it as mainly a way in which the two hemispheres, yes, keep in touch, but make sure that they don't interfere. So there's something very fascinating about two ways of looking at the world there. So that is what I have been exploring, both in that book that you mentioned and in the book that I'm writing now. And I've noticed that what has happened is that there have been, there was a resounding silence from an awful lot of the neuroscience world, but I'm not sure they knew quite what to make of a book that covered neuroscience, but then went into the philosophical implications of that and even the historico-cultural implications. The historico-cultural implications of that. And, but there were a number of really exceptionally interesting people who are fairly well known in the neuroscience world. And unfortunately, amongst those people, it's had a really, on the whole, remarkably good reception. So that people like Ramachandran that you mentioned, you know, a number of people, I won't go through names, but people can go to my website and have a look at responses to my work. But I think that it's going to take a while for the idea, they're so different from the way most people think, that it will take a while to get rooted, as I think it was Niels Bohr, or it might have been Max Planck, said that science moves forward funeral by funeral, in the sense that you don't change people's minds, you wait for them to go, and younger people who are more open to your ideas to pick them up. And I already find that a lot of younger neuroscientists write to me and say, this is fascinating, this has changed my whole thinking. So I'm fairly optimistic about that. To come to the question of what the sort of main differences are, let me try to do my best to be quite succinct. They stem from a difference of attention. in my view, the survival value of being able to pay two different kinds of attention to the world is so great that every living creature can do this. Why? Because every living creature needs to do two things. It needs to be able to navigate the environment, manipulate the environment, pick up things to eat. If it's a bird, pick up a stick to build a nest. It needs to catch a rabbit. Whatever it is, the animal needs in order to survive, to pay targeted attention to get something or to manipulate something. And at the same time, it needs a quite different kind of attention, because if it's so taken up in that very narrowly focused attention, it focuses about 3 degrees out of the 360. So you can imagine it's effectively blind to everything else. Then it's going to be very vulnerable, because it's going to become someone else's lunch while it's getting its own. So for that very reason, creatures have developed the capacity to pay two kinds of attention to the world at once. One, very narrow, very precisely focused, committed to something you already know what it is, and that's why you're interested in it. And the other, exactly the opposite, uncommitted as to what it will find, on the lookout, vigilant, broad, and sustained. Now, and that's a very robust finding across all species, mammals, birds, reptiles, you name it. Even back, we think, to trilobites looking at the fossils. So there was no question about it. And a couple of very leading neuroscientists, one of them an expert in schizophrenia, Tim Crow, who said that nothing in human psychology or psychiatry makes any sense outside of an understanding of lateralization. And another is Onno Gunterkuhn in Germany, who won Germany's most prestigious prize for science, which was work on lateralization in animals. He says that there is nothing in the human brain, nothing that we do in cognition, in emotion, in motor action, which is not asymmetrical in some way. So I think, the chances that there's nothing in it are extraordinarily small. Besides which, the proof is there. On a neurological ward, I trained neurologically rather than in a lab. And when you see patients who have had a stroke or a tumor, it's not just the site in the brain, but the side. So the same place, as it were, in the mirror image position on the other side of the brain will produce completely different, reliably different, predictably different effects on the person. So there are big differences. And they stem from this difference of attention. Now, attention is very, very important. Attention is how the world comes into being for us. And we participate in what comes into being by the kind of attention we dispose towards the world. In fact, attention is nothing more nor less than the disposition of your consciousness towards the world. You can dispose it in one way, to get things, to grab them very narrowly, or in another receptive, open, uncommitted way to connect. And attention is something that can either alienate by staring at something, by threatening something, alien from you, or can be the base of love. In fact, a certain kind of attention is what love is. Louis Louvel, early 20th century French existential philosopher, wrote that la charité est une pure attention à l'existence d'autrui. In other words, love is a pure attention to the existence of the other. And that seems to me both beautiful and profound. I'm still not got to what are the differences that come from these differences in attention, but let me take you there now. Well, the first one you can see is the one kind of attention fragmentary. So it sees a part and another and another. So it sees bits, it sees pieces, it sees parts. It doesn't see the whole. And its idea of what a whole is something that you make up afterwards by the bits that you got, much as you might build a machine. You have some parts, you put them together, there we have it. a quite different way of attending, sees the whole, and only secondarily notices that there are some areas of the whole that it can lock its attention onto and call parts. But in order to understand the nature of the parts, it would have to know what the whole was to which it belonged, because context changes what it is. Just as much as to know what a whole is to know the things that go to constitute it. So one of the hemispheres is able to see parts and wholes, but the other is only able to see parts. Then the left hemisphere is keen on decisiveness, in the sense that it's the quick and dirty part of our attention. It can't afford to get too subtle. It can't afford to have too many doubts. It has to be either or, black and white. It's this or it's not, no nuances. Because it's got to act, it's got to take, it's got to get in there. It hasn't got time to go, yeah, but it might be or it might not be. Now, Ramachandran calls the right hemisphere the devil's advocate, because it's always seeing that it could be something else, that it has other aspects to it, and it depends how you look at it. But the right hemisphere has this see things from different angles, because it's seeing a very big picture, but the left hemisphere sees its spotlight on things. So that means that what it sees is fragmentary and disconnected, but also that it's familiar, because it's now this or it's that. So it's one of those, I've got it, I've put it in my category, I've pigeonholed it, I've put it in a box, now I know what it is, now I can relax. But the right hemisphere sees that things very rarely fit very well in the boxes. And in fact, to get anything into a box, you have to cut it off from the web that surrounds it so that it can be fitted into a box. It's always connected, ultimately with everything else, but certainly immediately with things around it that alter its nature. The context of something changes utterly the nature of what it is. So the right hemisphere sees things in context and interconnected, but the left as separate and out of context, decontextualized. Now, one of those important contexts is the body. Everything that we have about us is, I'd like to say, amphibian. We are spiritual beings. We are physical beings. And these are not contraries. They have to be held together. And there's a tendency to want to derogate one or the other and make human beings into one or the other. But the right hemisphere has a better connection with the body and emotions, which are very physical things, and are by no means just some sort of luxury. They're how we understand complex matters. And people who have right hemisphere damage quite often cease to be able to understand what's going on, what people mean when they say things. They can't interpret behavior. They can't see what another person would be thinking. They lose what we call theory of mind, which is the sense of what's going on for another person. They're locked into their own ego. So the right hemisphere is connected to the body in a number of ways. It has what's called the body image, which is by no means a visual image. It is the sense, the sort of below awareness sense of one's body all around, much as one might feel it in a kind of meditation that you and I have practiced. And it has better connections with the limbic system, which is a part of the brain, an ancient part of the brain, which holds together cognition with emotion. And with the so-called HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which governs all that our body is getting on with outside our consciousness and over which we have no control, the autonomic governance of our body. So you've got one part of the brain that is abstracted out of context, that sees things as fragmentary, sees them as familiar, and the right hemisphere is seeing them as unique cases that are not necessarily fittable into categories, that ramify into other things, that change and that flow. Because the left hemisphere wants to fix them. When you think about how traditional biology approaches nature, it takes slices, it fixes them, then it's got something it can hold on to. But in fact, a cell is a fluid. We're all actually a collection of cells, and a cell doesn't even have something as solid as a cell wall in the way that probably most people conceive it. That wall is actually a moving fluid mass. So, and then there are a whole lot of others. I mentioned uniqueness, which is an important thing, but also implicitness. Now, much of what is valuable, I would say almost everything that is valuable that we understand and know, has to remain implicit. I first realized this when I was trying to help people understand poetry, that if you paraphrase it, you've completely lost it. You haven't got something like the poem. You haven't got anything at all. You're left with a handful of doubts. It's a vanishing trick. It's amazing. You cannot make it explicit any more than you can tell a joke. And someone says, well, I don't understand it. Then you explain it. Oh, yeah, funny. No, jokes are not funny when they have to explain. But neither are any of the really important things in our lives able to be made explicit. All the really profound things, experience of love, spiritual experience. None of these are well served by language or by analysis. And if we stick only to what can be asserted in language and what can be analysed, we fail to see whole realms of existence, and not just incidental ones, but the ones that are really of the core value to us. Then I suppose there are a few other things that the left hemisphere tends to quantify. The right hemisphere sees more of what is the quality. The left hemisphere tends to be over-optimistic. It tends not to see problems. It tends, even when it is clearly in the wrong, that it is always right, that it can't have made a mistake, and that indeed there can't be anything wrong with it. So extreme is this, is that if you compare somebody who has a left hemisphere stroke with somebody who has a right hemisphere stroke, the person who's had a left hemisphere stroke, so their right hemisphere is still operating, they're very aware of what they've lost, and they're devastated by it. But when they have a right hemisphere stroke, they no longer are aware that they've lost anything. They don't know what it is that they haven't got. They never see what it is they don't know. And so they don't even strive for it anymore, which is why it's harder to rehabilitate them. It's easier to rehabilitate someone after a left hemisphere stroke, despite loss of speech and use of the right hand, than it is after a right hemisphere stroke, because people don't understand and they're not aware of what they've lost. So there's a sort of pernicious optimism, and person who has a paralyzed whole half of the body will totally deny that it's paralyzed and say they can run a mile. They can't. So this is where we're at. And then there is the issue of, and this is a very, very important one, probably even the core one, is the difference between the presence of something and its representation.
Right.
Now, I deliberately pronounce it like that, in that when something is represented, it is automatically no longer present with us. Mm-hmm. It was present, and this is the ghost of it. And this ghost of it is always something that has none of the qualities of the thing that it represents. And the best way to think of this is like the difference between a map and the territory that it maps. Mm. So a map is very, very schematic and simple compared with the land that it maps. There's an almost infinite range of difference. But the map is very useful. Without the map, we might not be able to navigate our way around at all. So we need that map. And it wouldn't be a better map if it had all kinds of irrelevant details in it about the types of vegetation and all the rest. It just needs to stick to what is important. Now, that's a slightly rough and ready way of thinking of it, but that is the effective distinction between something that presences, as Heidegger would have said to us, inventing a verb that we don't have in English. In fact, he didn't have it in German. He took the noun anwesen and turned it into a verb. And so we have to take the noun presence and turn it into a verb, which philosophers do. When something presences to us, it's not just present in a sort of passive way. It is actually bringing itself forward, manifesting itself in our attention. And we have a connection with it. And that is quite different from a representation, which is dead, finished, and schematic, and so on. So, but now in our world, we spend a lot of our time fixing things. I mean, fixing in the sense of stopping the flow, disconnecting them. We have a fragmentary vision. We try to categorize everything. We lose the sense of the unique. We're over-optimistic about what we're doing. We ignore all the valuable knowledge and experience which is not explicit and can't be rendered in language. And we live in a world of representations on screens in whatever way, but just not being in contact anymore with the vividness of life. Now, I hope that sorry, it was a perhaps a bit long, but I had to cover a lot of ground. But that gives you some idea of the differences.
No, that's fabulous. Thank you so much. I think that really, I mean, that gives us a lot of potential avenues to explore. But maybe just beginning with the last distinction that you drew is very interesting because it echoes a very similar distinction that's made in Buddhist thought and practice, which is that actually, but the division is into three, not two realms. So we speak about the realm of mere images, which is what we might experience when we're dreaming. So they're just from the imagination, and then the world of representations, which is a sort of like you said, it's the map, not the territory. And then the world of reality in itself, or suchness. So this is obviously a borrowed term from Western philosophy, but it matches quite closely what is in the the traditional texts. And that world of reality in itself, things in themselves, or suchness, is very interesting to ask ourselves, to what extent are we in touch with it ever? Or is it rare? Is it every day? Is it, and if, and are there ways that we can be more in touch with that world of what can also be called direct perception, or things in themselves without the intervention of a sort of mental filter, which could also mean it has to be without the intervention of language. It's possibly very rare and hard to sustain, because we're so accustomed to dealing with the world through the intermediary of naming and designating, and then all the mental categories that sort of are built upon that. And so what was interesting to me was that you spoke about presencing, and what we focus on a lot is this idea of bringing our awareness back to the present moment. Because as you were saying, when something is just a representation to us, it becomes kind of like a ghost. It's not the real thing with all its qualities. And this is very much like what our teacher speaks about. He takes very concrete examples like drinking a cup of tea. He said, if you're not there, if you're not present, then the cup of tea is a ghost, and you are a ghost. And you might drink the cup of tea and not even taste it. You could be thinking about something completely different. Your mind might be wandering in the future or in the past, and what you might experience is perhaps just a past experience of tea. And that, I believe, relates to the predictive brain, that it's actually more energetically economical for us to rely on past experiences and make predictions on the basis of those, than to sort of bother finding out, okay, what is particular about this cup of tea. So we usually, we try to make that extra effort to bring ourselves back to the present moment and re-experience. So we talk a lot in Zen about beginner's mind. Can we drink that cup of tea as if it's the first cup of tea we've ever encountered? Can we become real again? Can we establish our presence? And then the tea becomes real, and then the experience becomes one of real life, of poetry, of depth, of richness. So it's extraordinary that there seems to be these very close parallels.
Yes, there are. I like the beginner's mind very much, for two reasons. One is that possibly one of the reasons why time goes much more slowly when you're a child is that you are constantly present, because everything is new. You don't have that enormous number of already digested experiences with which to sort of rob it of its immediacy. And this is something that one of my favorite poets, Wordsworth, refers to as shades of the prison house close about the growing boy, because in childhood and in his early years, he felt present with nature and he talks constantly about this living being, this living presence that is there with him. And you can even hear its breathing, which is a lovely idea, especially in the context of what we have been talking about with breath. You can hear nature breathing. But as he got older, he began to have to strive to see something for what it is, not to say, oh, it's one of those, it's a picturesque scene, it's a lake, it's a mountain, I get it, but to actually be there with it. This is something that Henry Thoreau, the American writer, is very good at, about botany, and how if you really want to see a plant, you have to put all your botany out of your mind. Actually, I think that botany can help in certain circumstances, but I know what he means. At that moment, you must be present with it. And you won't have, as he says, a paper to deliver to the Royal Society, but you will actually know a plant. So I think that's very important. And of course, mindfulness, which I assume is a form of well, it is a form of Buddhist practice, is one way of trying to recapture that business of not having things to say, no judgments to make, to still all that monkey mind, all that desire to get hold of it and do something with it, and just let it be for once. And that, of course, is a very healing thing. I've had experience of that myself and with patients. And there is, in fact, a text which you may know, and I'm trying to think what it's called. I think it might be called either Mindfulness Simplified or A Beginner's Guide to Mindfulness, but it's by an extremely well-known, very much venerated Indian monk who has a very, very long name, which is why I can't remember it. But it's extraordinarily good. And in the book I'm writing, I take a shortish passage from him and illustrate 23 points in the range of a few sentences where he makes a distinction between the way the right hemisphere would see this and how the left hemisphere would see it. It's called Bhante, something that begins with a G. I'm sorry, I'm just not very good with Indian names. Anyway, another thing really that is very important is helping people out of their very alienated mental state, particularly people who are deeply depressed, because they have really lost touch in a way with the experience of being there. And one of the first steps they can take, because they often can't do anything very much, even getting dressed or getting washed is really, really difficult. And I say to them, do some very, very simple thing. It may take you a while, but perhaps make a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. And then just sit and feel the warmth in your hands and look at the cup and be there with it. And, and taste it and go, yes, the taste of tea. And just be in the moment. And that, a lot of patients, it's not, you won't find it in any of the books, but a lot of my patients found that extraordinarily good advice.
Right. Well, this is, for us, an entry point to the practice. I mean, it's like you're describing an exercise of mindfulness. And I want to rewind a little bit to something you said earlier when you were sort of laying out the territory or drawing these distinctions between the world of the right hemisphere and the world of the left hemisphere. And you spoke about these two types of attention. And it was very interesting because in an earlier dialogue with Dr. Elena Antonova, which everyone that's watching now will have already seen, she had us do a very interesting exercise, which was to attend to the sensations of our feet in two different ways, using language to direct our awareness in a sort of guided meditation. So the first time she said, she invited us to close our eyes and then to pay attention to the sensations in our feet. And then we stayed with that for a while, and then she had us open our eyes and take a little, sort of reset. And then we closed our eyes again. And she said, now I'd like you to become aware of the sensations in your feet. So it was just that distinction of pay attention to and become aware of. And then without telling us, what we were supposed to feel or expect, she had us report on that experience and to see if we could identify how the two experiences felt from the inside. And I think both of us, Liam and I, reported something quite similar, which is this this sense that when we're invited to pay attention to, it's as if there's a kind of, there's somebody here which is looking down and sort of focusing in on what my experience was of a point of awareness which jumped around within the sensations of my feet. And then when she said, become aware of, what I experienced was a field of sensations, which was sort of edgeless and quite spacious. And that it wasn't that I was here looking at them, but more that I don't know, there wasn't, it was more like I was in my feet, something like that.
Yes. No.
Which is
so would you feel that actually does correspond to these two different ways of apprehending the world? Sorry, Liam, maybe you want to comment.
Well, I mean, also for our participants who'll be following their breath all week, there's a similar to following your breath versus paying attention to your breath. I think a lot of people notice that, and also would notice it in some other traditions. Yoga, for example, you consciously sculpt your breath versus following your breath, right? And practitioners of these different traditions don't necessarily see them as different things, but from the kind of attention we're talking of allowing things to occur to you versus attending to, those are very different things, is seems to be what you're saying.
Yes, that's right. And of course, there's purely a linguistic question here, which draws attention to the fact that in the West, what we mean by pay attention is pay a particular kind of attention, a rather highly focused, possibly alienating kind of attention. But of course, both the broader awareness of the right hemisphere and that attentional beam of the left hemisphere are just different ways of attending. So, but they are different elements. And I think that what I want to pick up there is the idea of inhabiting rather than making an effort to sort of do, sculpt, see what it is one's doing. So when one inhabits, one's not actually trying to change anything. One's allowing oneself to be there and allowing what is there to be present to you. I had to reflect on this recently because I've been writing, one whole section of my book is about what one might broadly call intuition and as it fades into imagination. And at one end, you've got things like the way in which Einstein made his discoveries and the way in which Shelley wrote his poems. And at the other, you've got very practical things like a tipster who, fascinating story, which I haven't got time to tell you, but if you buy my new book when it comes out, you will hear it. But about how he makes winning decisions about horses, and he hasn't the slightest clue how. And as soon as he asks himself to analyze, he completely ruins it. And another was from a doctor who is the consultant to the TT races. The TT races are an annual event on the Isle of Man, which is often referred to as the most dangerous sporting event in the world. It takes place not on a racing track, but on the public highway, and all public traffic is banned for 2 weeks on a mountainous island. And motorcyclists race this at speeds up to 200 miles an hour. And it's not a smooth course. It has bends in it, it has bridges in it, it has drain covers, it has pieces of rough paving. Now, he said to one of the motorcyclists that as they came past the grandstand, they suddenly went down a deep hill with a bend at the bottom, so fast, often at that stage at about 175 miles an hour. He said to them, you must be inch perfect as you pass the grandstand. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to take the bend at the bottom of the hill. And he said, when you pass the grandstand, you're at Quater Bridge. And Quater Bridge is a mile further down the track. So in his mind, he wasn't even there, in a sense. He was inhabiting a whole course. And if he thought about that thing he saw there, it would just destroy him. And they all describe this, that time slows down. Even though they're going so fast, they feel they've got all the time in the world. Things are very, very slow. And that's not because there's no time or there's no sense of time, but because there's so much in the swim of time that there's no discrepancy between them and the flow of time. They're not sort of standing outside it, looking at it passing. They're actually in it going. And they have no awareness of their body, but their perceptions are incredibly astute. They can hear things, they can see things, but it's not in the sense of paying attention to them. They have to actually just be there. They're in the body so much, their perceptions are so great that they almost lose the sense of the body. I just thought that worth telling you because it's a fascinating parallel to what I understand can happen in certain spiritual practices.
It sounds very much like a flow state experience that we were also discussing with Eleanor the other day. No, this is wonderful. I want to bring us back to make a general point as well, which I think is very helpful to guide these types of discussions, which is that, when we discuss things that could become abstract or philosophical, I always think it's very helpful to have a kind of guideline, which is to ask ourselves constantly the question, what does this have to do with my suffering? Or what does this have to do with transforming suffering? Or what does this have to do with, with real human suffering in the world? And that's why I think it's wonderful that you speak of, your patients as a psychiatrist and stroke patients and so on, so that we can see that these things actually relate to, they make a difference. How we attend to the world makes a difference in how the world manifests to us, and then how we feel about it, and perhaps a very profound difference, and that then ripples out to the level of the whole of society, as it were. So what I found very interesting in your book was that, in my very rough sort of gloss of it, you gave this very profound kind of overview analysis of the imbalance, and then the way that imbalance in our brains feeds back and is generative of things that we see in society and reinforces certain things in society, and perhaps that feeds back and facilitates the dominance of the left hemisphere over the right, and so that there's this powerful feedback effect, and we get pushed further and further towards a sort of left hemisphere world, and that without wanting to discriminate against the left hemisphere isn't bad or wrong. It's just that when things are out of balance, things can start to they don't work in the way that we might like them to. So it's a question of balance, not a question of good hemisphere, bad hemisphere. But
Right.
when what I found, over the whole scope of your book, was this sort of picture of potentially what's wrong, or what we need to address as individuals and as a society, but without wanting to be critical in any way, there was a sense that it wasn't clear what one should actually do about this. That there wasn't necessarily action that could be taken to restore this this balance. Or maybe there were some things, but what was striking to me as I was reading was a little bit what you described with the monk from India, that it seemed to me that almost everything that our teacher has shared with us could sort of match up with qualities of the right hemisphere that are being trained or encouraged or helped to be restored in the balance. And so that's really the question I wanted to explore with you today is, do you think, for example, just to take this very example, this case that we've already looked at a little bit of the different kinds of ways that we can be with our body and attend to the body, do you think it's possible that just by choosing to pay attention to the body in this more right hemispheric way, we might actually be restoring the balance actively of the hemispheres?
I do think that, yes. You touched on a lot of things there. I mean, one of them is just the importance of how we do attend for the world that we experience. It's very striking in the case of people with strokes because the world is utterly different. But it's true also for all of us every day. I have the experience that some days I feel joyful and positive, and other days I feel utterly weighed down like there's a huge stone on my chest. And I think, what is it? And I cannot find a single thing. And it's to do with the kind of attention I'm paying to the world at the time. You can alter the world you are in by redirecting your attention. So exercises that enable you to do that can help your own attention. But then there's the question which we need to tie together with it, which is the question about a whole society and how it can begin to espouse certain ways of attending. And of course, what I need to clarify is that it's not that somehow we've all had a right hemisphere stroke, or it would be better if we had a left hemisphere stroke or anything like that. No, the point is that each hemisphere contributes, but it contributes in a way which is a formula which I have found in virtually every tradition that I've looked at, which is that there is a master and there is a servant, in my terms, the emissary. And these two are valuable. The master needs the servant needs the master. But they must retain that relationship, that the master is the one that is overall in control. If the servant starts to become the master, all is lost. And I found that in Indian Buddhism, I found it in Chinese literature, I found it in Japanese literature, I found it in North American native people's mythologies, I found it in Polynesian mythologies, I found it everywhere. There is always this wisdom insight. And of course, unfortunately, we live in an age which is besotted with the idea that everything is equal to everything else, whereas in my view, that's not to see the world, because nothing is equal to anything else. Which doesn't mean that one shouldn't always be humble and tolerant and kind, but it's nothing to do with equality. So when you start thinking about the hemispheres, they must be of equal value, but they absolutely are not. The right hemisphere grounds our world. Really, when you lose that, you've lost touch with reality. When you have damage to the left hemisphere, you can't manipulate the world so well. But the world is, broadly speaking, still there for you. The recognizable world, the same world that other people are still in. What the left hemisphere has evolved to do is something very special, which came to us with language. But it actually started to happen before that with the great apes that don't have language, which is to conceptualize, to be able to stand back and manipulate symbols in the brain. And that is what the left hemisphere does. It manipulates very efficiently symbols. It carries out procedures. And it carries them out in language, and it can carry them out in calculation. So can the right hemisphere, by the way. But the left hemisphere's difference is it doesn't really understand the meaning. It might be faster at doing them, but actually it doesn't understand the utterance overall that it's just produced. It's perfect in terms of its grammar, but what it actually means is what the right hemisphere gets. It's the same with a calculation. A right hemisphere can do a rough and ready calculation, which will be more close than the left hemisphere. If it gets it slightly wrong, it won't see that this can't possibly be the answer. So it has a better grasp of the meaning of the whole. And although I utterly repudiate the idea that there's anything about the brain that is like a computer, it is quite helpful to think of the left hemisphere as our own personal computer. So as with a computer, you gather data from the world of experience. You want certain procedures carried out that would stop you leading a life and would take you forever. So you give it to the computer, you press a button, it gets on with it, it then spews back the data. But that data doesn't mean anything until you take it back into the same world from which you took the original raw data. So that is the you in that is your right hemisphere. The computer in that is the left hemisphere. So it's not surprising that when you're actually in touch with reality, and I have an enormous amount of different ways of approaching this in my new book, you can demonstrate that it's the right hemisphere that is in touch with reality, and to rely on what the left hemisphere tells you is not good news. Now, the problem in societies, and this has happened 3 times in the West to my way of thinking, and that's the second part of the Master and his Emissary, is that in the case of the Greeks, in the case of the Romans, and in the case of our own civilization since the Enlightenment, we've gone from a situation in which we had a good balance of these two very necessary things, in which the servant served the master well, to one in which the servant has become the master. It happened 3 times over. Every time the civilization collapsed, it became over-concerned with power, with greed, with militarism, with hierarchy, with sameness, with bureaucracy, and it lost its insight and its quality, and it deteriorated. So it's very important that that doesn't happen. And when people think about this, they get into a sort of mental cul-de-sac. But all our brains can't have changed in this way. What I'd like to say to explain that is, no, they're not really very different. So good news, your brain is still there to function, you know. So coming back to your point, we can help it in the right direction. But it's rather like this. Suppose you get a radio set, and to begin with you're very excited and you listen to several different channels. And after a while, you quickly settle down that this is the channel you're going to tune into. And you never bother to tune into any other channel. The radio set hasn't changed. It's what you do with it. Now, your radio set, the brain, and I think there's more in that, but I perhaps won't go there now. I think that consciousness is not created by the brain, but permitted by the brain. But anyway, that's another matter. But the point I'm wanting to make is that we use the brain now in a certain way. And it may have something to do with what happens when a civilization becomes very large and urban. It conducts most of its things by public discourse, which becomes crude, propositional, and no longer rooted in the subtleties of individual experience. And so we get a public debate which is crude in the extreme, violent in its terms, angry and aggressive. And by the way, for those people who still think that the left hemisphere must be, well, maybe rather boring, but at least reliable and has no emotions, no, the most lateralized emotion in the brain happens to be anger. And guess what? It lateralizes to the left hemisphere. So there we are, divided, angry, looking at things in black and white terms, trying to fit people and things into categories, paranoid, because the left hemisphere it needs to control. It doesn't understand imagery anymore, doesn't understand metaphor, doesn't understand symbols, takes everything literally, as in our society now people take humor. I mean, I've noticed something over the last 10 years, metaphorical statements, humorous statements are interpreted literally, which is what the left hemisphere is blind to, metaphor and humor, doesn't understand it, takes it all seriously. Well, that is where we've gone. So we need to row back. And I suppose your question was, what can we do? And I sometimes rather unfairly say it's the typical left hemisphere question. I want to fix. I want to put a plaster on this and it's all going to be all right. I want 8 bullet points that I can do before breakfast and phew, it's all going to be okay. So it's not like that. It's a path, you know, a Tao, a journey. It's something also that, like the Tao, one doesn't determine, but one has a choice about whether one follows it. So the choice element is not about this is how we do it. The choice is I'm going to stop doing many of the things that I do that I now see are unproductive. And I'm going to open myself to hear, to see, to understand for the first time things that are there for the knowing, if I can only be receptive to them. And that could be encouraged by a lot of things in society. I think educational system is an obvious case. And I think that children should learn a number of things in school that they don't now. And this doesn't mean softening the curriculum. I think they should be intellectually stretched. But I do also think they should have a period in the day where they practice being quiet and being mindful, that they also learn negotiation skills so that we don't have a horde of people who think the way you get on with others is to shout them down. And I think they should be taught the essences of very simple cognitive principles, which are there in things like, the most simple cognitive therapy, how we distort things in our own minds. Once you learn to see it, you can then detach yourself from those things that tug you here and there. In a quite Buddhist way, you can go, no, that's that bit of me saying that. I don't have to attend to it. And so I think all of that would be important. I think a greater emphasis on the humanities and on music, literature and philosophy, helping people to see there are two sides to every question would be a very important thing as well. So all these things help you to grow, to listen more, to be present more, not to be so sure you're right and to follow your path and to go get, but seeing that you are connected to society, you were never separate from it, you grew out of it and you go back into it, that you are connected from nature. It is not an environment, it is not something that is environ, around you, it is something that is in you and you are in it and you came out of it and go back to it. And the same is true of the cosmos, that we came out of the cosmos and we go back into the cosmos and we exemplify something that is there in the cosmos. We didn't put it there. The cosmos put it there. We expressed it.
And this is what I find very interesting, which is a lot of our practice is, could be said to be retraining our way of seeing. Not just seeing, but hearing, sensing, conceiving. So the way that we conceive of the world, other people, environment. There's an extraordinary talk in which our teacher, he held up a leaf and he looked at the leaf and he said, I think this is original sin. To cut out this leaf and say that that it is a leaf, to distinguish it, to cut it off from everything else, because there is no leaf without the tree, without sunlight, without the rain, without the air, without the earth, without time and space and consciousness even. So just this sort of cutting of the world into little pieces that we do, perhaps is really at the root of a lot of our suffering. And this would correspond to, what in Buddhism is known as, wrong view, essentially. And that, almost all of our training helps us to gradually take this path, as you said, towards right view, which is actually the absence of all views. And quite challenging, but this sort of state of openness, actually, of not knowing, of being open to be in touch with and to receive and to be in this experience of what our teacher calls interbeing, which you've coined a word which is quite close, which is to be in the betweenness. And I think it's very, very sort of nice to draw that parallel as well.
What I mean by betweenness is not a space between. nor is it just the coming together of two things. It is a sort of electricity or field or magnetism of two elements or more than two elements, not excluding those elements that we identify, and not just the connections between them, as we put it, but the whole that they compose together. And I actually argue in my new book, which is supported by physics, that relations are prior to the things that are related. That things that are related are just identified by us for practical purposes as nodes, as it were, in a net of interconnectedness. So I think this has meaning at many levels. And one of the good things about it is that it transcends the subject-object divide. One thing I'd like to make clear is that it's not that somehow the left hemisphere is objective and the right hemisphere is subjective. It's that the right hemisphere feels, experiences, though finds it impossible to articulate given the language that the left hemisphere has offered it, that there is no separation between subjective and objective, whereas both subjective and objective are the alternatives open to the left hemisphere.
Right.
So as often these things are at right angles to the way they're often set up. So those are kind of important elements in the picture. And one thing I'd just like to talk about, because it's relevant to what I said earlier, is our responsiveness. That the whole of the way we are and of what truth means is a relationship. Truth is related to the word truth and to trust. It's the kind of loyalty that exists in a relationship that has value and has love in it. And truth is therefore not some wishy-washy thing that we can all make up. It's something very, very real. But it involves both response and responsiveness and responsibility. So that when we're connected to things, we respond to them, they respond to us. We must be open to responding to them, allowing them to speak to us. And we must also both take responsibility for what we do that will affect the rest of creation. And we need to take responsibility for ourselves. And at the moment, I feel we're in a society where people like to outsource responsibility for themselves to somebody else or something else, but at the same time take little responsibility for the nature, the earth, the cosmos that is theirs.